speaker today, but first I want to give you a couple of background things. For most of you that are familiar, this is our Hot Topics lecture series. We do it Tuesday and Thursday weekly, except next week we're on break, so there is no Hot Topic lecture. It's a brown bag event for anyone that has your lunch, and I can see some of you there. Feel free to enjoy it. And at the end we'll have a short question and answer session. So come up with your working questions. Today I'm just really excited to be able to introduce Tim McDonald. I've had a little bit of time to share a beer at the Worthy Burger and chat and talk to Tim quite a little bit. And Tim's a reporter with Mother Jones and associate producer of the Climate Desk, an international collaboration that includes Mother Jones, The Atlantic, The Guardian, Huffington Post, Slate, Wired, Grist, and the Center for Investigative Reporting, and it produces original media journalism on climate change. So I think we've all heard about a lot of those entities and read them regularly. He covers many angles of climate change, from science to environmental politics to business, and is currently based out of New York City. We talked a little bit about New York when he's here. And today he's going to talk about talk about solar wars, and I'm very excited to hear that. So, Tim, welcome.
You all can hear me okay. All right, thanks. Thanks, Kevin, for the introduction. And I want to say thank you also very much to Courtney Collins and the whole Vermont Law School for having me as the media fellow. The last 2 weeks have been really great. Learned a lot. It's just, I can't think of a better way to spend 2 weeks in the summer. So yeah, as Kevin said, well, I guess I don't need to introduce myself. Is this working? You know, I swear it was working just a second. Okay. I have to figure out why it's not working. It should be. Okay, here we go. Okay, great. Yay. Crisis averted. Oh, I don't have to introduce myself, I guess, but yeah, I'm Tim McDonald. I'm a staff environment reporter for Mother Jones. And as Kevin said, the associate producer of Climate Desk, which is a group that Mother Jones spearheads that basically includes these partner publications, and we basically make climate-related content that we share with these partners for free, and by the same token, we take climate-related stories that they do and just trade those around as well. So it's kind of like a wire service, and I'll talk about why that's important in a bit. So I'm talking about this kind of really amazing thing that we've been reporting on a lot, which is the kind of explosion of solar power as a dominant kind of emerging force in the energy universe, this kind of new thing that's happening, and how that's creating a lot of interesting conflicts. And I'll talk briefly about how we cover that also. And my promise to you is that if you make it through the whole thing and don't give me too much of a hard time afterwards, I have a silly video about the climate deniers bashing the Pope afterwards that I will show you. So let's start by talking about what's the deal with solar power in the U.S. right now. How is solar doing? So this is a chart of where America gets its power, and you can see that I'm going to throw a lot of charts at you at the very beginning here, so bear with me. So this one, you can see that the biggest story on this chart, right, is the ascendancy of natural gas and the decline of coal. That's kind of the big, in terms of like the 30,000-foot view, trends in American energy, like that's the kind of biggest story. And then this yellow line that's down at the bottom includes solar. And so it's a really small percent. Solar overall is like 1% or less of the total US power mix. So it doesn't seem like that much, but actually this chart kind of conceals a different story, which is super interesting, which kind of boils down to this crazy number, 139,000%, which is the amount that US solar production has grown in the last decade. So if you look at the number of megawatt hours of solar power produced in the US a decade ago compared to now, that's an insane amount of growth. And it's not easy to see, or not hard to understand like how that would be totally disruptive to systems. Here's another kind of way of looking at that, some more charts. These are all taken from stories that I've done in the past, by the way. Solar installations growing 66% a year. It's far faster than any other energy source. If you remember that first chart, natural gas is adding a lot more in terms of megawatts, but the rate of growth, solar is by far the fastest. This is a kind of representative snapshot of new capacity being installed in the US in the first quarter of 2014. It's not always, and you see solar is like 3/4 of it. It's not always like that. This is just sort of a representative snapshot. So it's huge, it's growing a lot. How is this, so what's kind of driving that growth? There's a few factors. So one of them is that there's a lot of sun. There's no limit on the amount of sun. Here's some cool solar facts. My readers love cool solar facts. So here's some facts. Like I said, I'm just kind of burning through these, so if you want to see them again, I'm happy to share this talk later. Of course, the cost is a big part of this too, so the cost of solar panels dropping precipitously over the last few years. There's another chart I had that I took out that shows that over the last like decade and a half or so, the cost of the average kind of rooftop solar system for a typical house has gone down by about 2/3. It's like 1/3 of what it was before. And then venture capital, there's just a lot more private sector money flowing into solar, which is also pushing the boom. Why is this a good thing? Who cares? Well, if you care about climate change, this is a huge deal. Obviously, already, just from existing US solar panels, we've already offset the carbon emissions from millions of cars. So it's a big part of the climate solution. It's also good for the economy. This is a snapshot of employment in the solar industry, which you can see is also taking off. And also the solar industry as a whole now employs more than twice as many people as the coal mining industry. So when you hear about like this war on coal, it's important to keep in mind that coal mining is actually a relatively small sector, and the renewable energy, the kind of the emerging clean energy economy is actually huge. Already just solar. I mean, and this doesn't even count wind. I mean, if you counted wind and like other renewable sources in this, I mean, it would be way bigger than coal or oil and gas. So I mean, this is just solar, and it's already more than twice as many people working in the industry as in coal.
That's US?
This is in the US. Yeah, good question. This is just the US. And then in the kind of biggest possible picture, this is the last chart at the beginning of this chart barrage. In the kind of biggest possible picture, why is this important? So this is a chart that's from a study that came out like about 2 or 3 weeks ago from Mark Jacobson at Stanford, who often, every once in a while, produces these studies that look at, what is the kind of pathway to going 100% renewable? Is that possible? And this is like really ambitious, obviously, and I don't think it's probably going to happen, but you can see that in the scenario where we do eliminate fossil fuels and nuclear altogether from the energy mix, solar is playing a huge role. So these two orange bars, including utility scale solar, so like big solar farms and rooftop solar systems, is like over 40% of the total energy mix. And remember, before I said now it's 1% or less. So there's a lot of growth to happen, and then we need to make that growth happen if we're going to decarbonize the energy sector completely, which if you care about climate change, I mean, that's the big upshot of all of this. So if you are if you're someone who cares about climate change, this is all really good news. If you're in the solar industry, obviously it's really good news, but not everyone is happy about it, as you might expect. This is disrupting an old system that's been in place for a long time. So let me give you a little bit of context about the arena that this is all being played out in. So now we've been talking about solar, let's talk about what solar is replacing, utility companies. So this is, here's a little bit of cool history. This is the Pearl Street Station. This is the first power plant, basically the beginning of the electric grid anywhere in the world. It was in Lower Manhattan, opened by Thomas Edison in 1844, burning coal, serving basically lamps in this part of Lower Manhattan, which, I mean, the map is kind of old and bad, but this is like where City Hall is. And basically the electric grid had just grew out from this point. Why am I telling you about this history? Why is this important? Well, it's important because in the amount of time since this was built, so over a century, the basic structure of the grid hasn't really changed that much. The way that utilities work hasn't changed that much, and there obviously have been improvements to the technology, and it's gotten a little bit better, but if you compare to other kinds of technologies like telephones, 1876, cars, 1908, I mean, this is even older than the first Apple computer, guys. So this is like really old, and think about the amount of change that's happened in these technologies in the amount of time that they've been around. I mean, the computer that I'm using to give you this presentation is like not even recognizable from the first Apple computer, and likewise for other things. So compared to other kinds of prominent technologies, the grid has changed very little, and the way the utilities work has changed comparatively very little. And it's not just the technology. What's actually more relevant to this conversation is the business model that utilities work on. So how do utilities make money? Well, obviously they sell electrons, but they also, the way that utilities have kind of grown up over time is that they make big investments in infrastructure. They have a monopoly over their service area, and they, in exchange for, they provide a public service, they provide the power, they build things like power plants and transmission lines and distribution centers, and in exchange for putting up the capital for those things, the state allows them to raise their rates. So we all basically pay for all of those infrastructure investments. And this is the way that the business model for utilities has kind of always worked, where they, it's kind of expansionist. They're wanting to build more, bigger infrastructure, because for them, the only concern, or the kind of capital concern in all of this, is that they provide power that's reliable. So they want to have a grid that's going to support their biggest need on the middle of the summer when everyone's running their air conditioners. So this is basically the business model that has worked for a long time, and it's made utilities super averse to risk. They just want to play everything safe. It's not a very innovative sector because there's no monopolies, there's no competition, and they're not, electricity is electricity. There's not a lot of need to really innovate. The main thing is that they provide reliable, affordable power. So they haven't really innovated that much relative to the other technologies I was saying. Okay, so this starts to bring us back to where we started, which is that now that whole structure is crumbling around them. Is the end of an era, for two reasons. One is, which is also interesting, not totally related to this talk, is the decoupling of economic activity and energy demand. So for a long time, when utilities were emerging as a thing, it was easy to justify expanding all the time because that was what you needed in order to power economic growth. But now, because of, a little bit, I guess, because of the growth of renewables, but mostly because of energy efficiency, because we just do a lot more with the power that we have. Now, economic growth is totally uncoupled from, so you see economic growth going up and up, but energy consumption staying relatively flat. So there's not a need to build. But now we're going to get back to solar. The other big thing is distributed generation. So distributed generation meaning rooftop solar panels, maybe some small wind farms, basically any form of power generation that isn't owned by the utility company. And you can see how if we had distributed generation sources from the very beginning, like those people, think back to those people in Lower Manhattan, if we had distributed generation the whole time, the whole business model for utilities would never have been necessary. It was only necessary because making power was a kind of capital-intensive thing. You had to buy fuel, you had to have this big power plant and so they had this whole business model where you have a centralized plant sending power in one direction. Now we're destroying that completely because with solar panels, everybody is kind of producing their own power, and it's kind of disrupting the whole thing. It's very disruptive. So in that context, you're going to have a lot of, this is where it starts to get interesting as a journalist. You're going to see lots of really interesting conflicts start to arise, and also some funny alliances. As David Worth would say, there's a lot of Baptist and bootlegger coalitions that actually arise from this kind of thing. Here's one. So here's a kind of look at this is kind of representative of the mood in the energy industry as a whole right now. Here's a quote. This is a recent quote. What we advise utilities is, you're going to have to reinvent yourselves and play a new role. The distributed generation pony has sort of left the barn and we're not going to put it back in. And that's the distributed generation pony. That's my decision. So yeah, there he is, Sonny, the distributed generation pony. So who said this quote? This was not the CEO of a solar company. It was not anyone from an environmental group. This was actually the senior energy director of Walmart, David Osman. So the battle lines in the kind of solar, in regards to putting pressure on lawmakers in Georgia to open up their regulations to allow companies like Walmart to be able to own more of their own solar. And actually Walmart has kind of emerged as this force in this argument. I'm not defending Walmart's green credentials here or anything. I'm just saying that the point is that the battle lines in the solar wars are not always the kind of conventional liberals versus conservatives or environmentalists versus big business. The waters are somewhat muddy. Here are some more examples of the types of characters that are involved here, and this is not by any means comprehensive, but it's just sort of characters from stories that I've done about this, so you get a sense of who the players are. So on your right-hand side, you have the kind of anti-solar contingent, which includes conservative think tanks like the Heartland Institute, which is all about pushing climate change denial. You have the American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC, which, for those of you who aren't familiar, ALEC is another kind of conservative think tank their whole modus operandi is that they draft legislation for state governments that kind of pushes conservative agenda items and use their considerable lobbying power at the state level, which is kind of more porous than the federal level, to advance conservative agenda items. Then you have some utility companies like Arizona Public Service, which I'll talk about more. You have the Koch brothers, our favorites at Mother Jones, who are sort of industrialist billionaire brothers who are, when you think about kind of shady money in politics, like these are basically the two guys that you're thinking of the most, who have financial ties either directly or indirectly to ALEC and the Heartland Institute. You have conservative lawmakers. I'm picking on Paul Gosar from Arizona, but he comes up in a story later, but there's more like him. And then you have state governments, Governor Scott Walker, now Republican presidential contender, who has been pushing his Public Service Commission, which consists of 3 members, all of whom were handpicked by Scott Walker and all of whom are former utility industry executives, and who now have purview over the rules governing the solar industry, pushing them to adopt anti-solar policies or roll them back. And then obviously conservative media organs like Politic 365. And then on the other side, at the top is the kind of classic solar Baptist and bootleggers thing that I was talking about. So Tusk, Tell Utilities, Solar Won't Be Killed, is a group in Arizona basically consisting of Tea Party conservatives and some libertarians who basically see access to solar as a free market issue. They think that state level policies that restrict solar are basically an instance of the government picking winners and losers, which they hate, obviously. And so have actually emerged as quite a significant force in Arizona politics, pushing for this, and they're all Republicans. And led by none other than Barry Goldwater Jr., the son of the kind of archetypal conservative Arizona senator. And then you obviously have solar companies, you have solar trade groups like the Alliance for Solar Choice, environmental groups like NRDC, and then some other utilities that are more progressive on this stuff, like the New York State Public Service Commission, which I'll talk more about later. And then it's not super clear. I put PG&E down there at the bottom. PG&E is the utility in the Bay Area, and they're a little bit more ambiguous. So it's not always totally clear. But this is just sort of an example of, when we talk about solar wars, this is the kind of 2 groups. So what are these people all fighting about? So I have to talk a little bit about energy policy, and I'm used to talking about this subject for general readers who have no idea about any of this stuff, who've never heard of any of this before. So I apologize if I'm telling you, this is a room full of environmental lawyers and energy people, so I apologize if I'm telling you things that you already know, or if I say something wrong. Hopefully I won't. But one of the big things that is often fought about here is a policy called net metering, which is essential to the growth of solar and which is really damaging to utilities, and I'll explain why. So the first thing you have to remember is that very few people, even if you have solar on your roof, you're not actually off the grid. Everyone, if you have solar on your roof, you're still connected to the grid. You still need to consume power from the grid sometimes when it's cloudy or if it's at night. Also, your solar panels on your roof don't produce power at the times when you need it the most. So solar production obviously is greatest in the kind of midday. Power consumption is greatest in the late afternoon when people come home from work and start to turn on their air conditioners and TVs and stuff. So there's a disconnect. What happens to that extra power is that it gets sent back into the grid. And net metering is the policy, and when the sun is gone or it's cloudy or whatever, then you're still consuming power from the utility. So net metering is the policy that tells utility companies that they have to take your power from your solar panels and use it in the grid, and that they have to pay you for it, and that they have to pay you retail rates for it, which they don't give you a check, they just roll your meter back. So that's kind of, so you can see how this is an essential policy for making solar economic, and it rewards people for trying to be green and invest in this technology. But it's obviously really bad for utilities. So think about the position of a utility company. Not only are you losing a customer for your electrons, not only do you have to pay retail rates for the solar that you're buying from people, which, by the way, are much more than the wholesale rates that the utility company would normally pay if they were purchasing power from some other coal-fired power plant or whatever. But remember that I just said that the people who have solar panels are still using the grid, and that the rates that people pay for their electricity include that investment in that grid infrastructure in them. So you have to pay people, they're still using the grid, solar people are still using the grid, and now they're not paying their fair share of it. Well, this is the argument of the utilities anyway. So, so you can see how this is like really problematic. And the side, and how much money are we talking about? Well, there was one study in California in 2012 that found the cost of net metering to be about $254 million. And that same study found that given the growth rates of solar in California, that figure could climb to about $1 billion by 2020. So it's, I mean, utility companies in California make billions of dollars in revenue, so it's not like, they're not gonna like go under tomorrow, but it hurts. I mean, that's a lot of money. And, but what happens to that money, it doesn't just disappear from their coffers. They get to take that $254 million and spread it out around their remaining non-solar customers in the form of higher rates. I mean, that's the way the whole system works. And so that's the effect that's called the cost shift. So where you have solar companies, basically not paying for the grid but still using it, those costs getting passed on to other customers, everybody's bills going up as a result. And utility companies are not happy about this. Some other people are not happy about it too. And then the kind of end game of the cost shift, if you kind of take it to its logical conclusion, is what utility executives like to call the death spiral, which is kind of melodramatic way of saying that people go solar, you lose their revenue, you have to raise the rates. That makes going solar look even more competitive relative to solar, so more people go solar, and then the universe explodes or something. I don't know, I haven't really figured out what the end product of all of that is. But someone dies, I guess. and the extent to which the cost shift and the death spiral are real, I think is still, I've interviewed a ton of people about this on all sides of the issue, and my sense is that this question is unsettled. I think there's a case to be made that there could in fact be a real cost shift, that could be something that solar advocates really need to reckon with in a more comprehensive way. It might be totally bogus. Environmentalists or the solar industry will tell you that they actually save utilities more money than they cost in net metering because they provide new sources of generation for the grid that the utility didn't have to pay for, and because they're all kind of spread out across the service area with these different solar homes, power is traveling less distances on the transmission lines, so there's less wear and tear, less power that's lost through transmission. So there are some benefits. Do they outweigh the cost? I don't know. I think that's still an unsettled question, and if there's someone in this room who's an energy economist who can correct me on that, or if there's some final decision, let me know afterwards, I don't know. And then I also included a picture on here of our friend Elon Musk, who I just learned for the first time is actually the cousin of Lyndon Rive, who's the CEO of Solar City. So these guys are, there's a whole kind of family network behind this clean energy revolution. And you may have seen, why I put Elon Musk on here, you may have seen the news a couple weeks ago that Tesla just came out with these home battery systems that are like $3,000. You put it in your house, and then rather than having to rely on the grid at all, you can store your extra solar power in a big battery and then use it whenever you want. And that's a technology that's missing right now, and is a kind of key part of making solar, really able to penetrate even more. So it could be that in a few years, if these like Tesla batteries are everywhere and the cost of them comes down and everybody gets them, then then everything I'm telling you will be irrelevant. So it's a rapidly changing industry. But again, to go back to utilities, compare that kind of innovation to the way that electric utilities have worked for the last 100 years. I mean, there's no comparable disruptive technology like that that I'm aware of. Okay, so how does this kind of play out in my job? So I'm going to tell you now about a few stories that I've done that are kind of case studies in these types of conflicts that I think are representative. Again, not comprehensive. There are way more stories that I haven't written, but these are just some to kind of give you an example of what we're really talking about here. Now that you have the background, here are a few case studies, stories that we did. And the line in bold italics at the top of each of these things is the name of the headline of the story that I wrote. If you want to look it up later, you can. So this is Arizona 1.0. Power company comes clean. We bankrolled Arizona's anti-solar blitz. So back in 2013, Arizona Public Service wanted to implement a $50 monthly fee for solar customers, which in their view would basically, the purpose of which would be to offset the cost shift. That eventually was, recently they got it approved to do a $5 fee. So they only like a tenth of what they wanted. But anyway, back in 2013, they were really trying to push for this $50 fee. Around the same time that they launched that campaign, TV viewers in Arizona started to see this ad blitz, basically slamming solar, attacking net metering specifically as a form of corporate welfare, calling Solar City, this is a screenshot from the TV ad at the top, calling Sunrun and Solar City, two of the biggest solar companies, the new Solyndras. It was just total dog whistling. So people are seeing these ads, and then the end of the story is that a couple of years after the ad came out, Arizona Public Service later, at first they claimed to have nothing to do with these ads, but then later they admitted that in fact they had been bankrolling the group that produced the ad, which also had been taking money from other Coke-affiliated groups. And APS said that they didn't know about the ads per se, but were just funding this group. But I mean, APS comes out with their own kind of anti-net metering initiative, then people start to see these ads. I mean, you can kind of connect the dots yourself. And it's not the first time or the last time that APS has involved themselves in political contributions of one kind or another. They also donated to the election campaigns of several pro-utility candidates for the Arizona Corporation Commission, which is the state agency that regulates power companies in Arizona. And there was some question at the time as to whether they had made those contributions with revenues that they had received from ratepayers, which is so sketchy if you think about it, because they're trying to install people to the commission who are going to approve their rate raises. Then they're taking that money to spend on campaigns to elect those same people. They claim that, I don't think it's really been discovered what the actual truth is, because, but they claim that these campaign contributions came only from employee donations. That's my disclosure. Okay, so here's, so Arizona 2.0. There's a lot of Arizona stuff. And I made this silly picture of a sketchy guy selling you a solar panel out of his trench coat. Our solar company is ripping you off. So this is another case. Back at the very end of 2014, there was a bipartisan group of members of Congress from the Senate and the House, from both parties, that sent a series of letters to the Federal Trade Commission and to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, asking them to open investigations about what they were alleging were deceptive trade practices by the solar industry in Arizona and I think Texas. Basically, saying that solar companies were misleading their customers about the risks involved in solar leases. So rather than buying solar panels, now a really popular business model for a lot of solar companies is you can lease the panels from them, and then you basically pay for the power. You pay the solar company instead of your utility, and you get solar for the panels themselves are free, and then you basically you lease the power back from them. And I was talking about this with Kevin the other day, actually, and there's probably some legitimate risk involved in these leases that may or may not actually be being fully disclosed in them. I mean, a lot of these leases are like 20-year long leases. The terms are like not super clear, and what these members of Congress were alleging was that that this is basically analogous to the kind of toxic mortgage market, or that there's going to be some kind of solar bubble when people default on these loans later, and that it's something that needs to be investigated. And I don't know, that might actually be true. I mean, there's some risk, and it's something that I'm interested in covering more, and Kevin and I were just talking about this the other day. But it turned out actually that this letter was not drafted by the members of Congress who signed it, but was actually written by an employee of Arizona Public Service who had passed it in secret to Representative Paul Gosar, a Republican congressman of Arizona, whose picture was out there earlier, who then applied his signature and the signatures of a group of other federal legislators that he was able to get on board with this thing and shoot it off. So it's not, this is not, and I actually looked, this isn't on the slide, but I went into the docket. There's a complaint docket that you can look at with the Arizona Corporation Commission where people file complaints about deceptive trade practices like this. And there was one person in Arizona who had complained to the Corporation Commission about solar being a boondoggle or something. I mean, it was kind of this nonsense complaint in the document, but that was the only one. So there's not like there's some kind of overwhelming public pressure to deal with this. It was just that they got this letter from APS. This is the letter, which was basically copied and pasted from an APS authored Word document and then put on this congressional letterhead and sent off to the FTC and the CFPB. And you'll notice that the letter also holds the signature, so Paul Gosar is the one on the top left, and then it also has the signature of Lamar Smith, who you may be familiar with as the totally crazy Republican congressman from Texas, who has this insane witch hunt against the National Science Foundation right now over their climate change science grants. And if you're not familiar with that story, check it out because it's super insane and ongoing. And I have to give a tip of the hat to the Arizona Center for Investigative Reporting, who was the first to report the connection between APS and this letter. They did some, great sleuthing. They basically obtained the original Word document and then were able to dive into the metadata of that document and found out who it had been originally authored by, and then sought and got confirmation from them that this had happened. And I contacted all of these people, and they all maintained that they stand by the content of the letter. But they're super vague about who actually came up with these ideas in the first place. So here's an example of one that's slightly less nefarious. I remember I said PGE is a little bit like in the middle. PGE has the most solar of any utility in the country. There's like 150,000 homes that they have hooked up with solar, which is a lot. It's way more than anyone else. And similar to Arizona, they wanted to impose a flat monthly fee for solar users to offset the cost shift, which I think that should have been ruled on by now. If somebody knows how that shook out. I did the story and then stopped paying attention to it. And the solar industry was saying that this is just a sneaky way to kneecap the competition. And this was just a story where I basically described the cost shift and got into some of the research of that I already told you about. So there's an example that was recent as well. Okay, Arizona 3.0, and by now I had a funny conversation with the public affairs person from Arizona Public Service because I really wanted to interview one of their executives for this particular story, and the price for me to do so was that I had to sit on the phone with this guy for an hour and a half while he read all of my other solar stories to me over the phone, telling me line by line what he hated about all of them. And I had to just sit there and smile and nod and listen to it, and then tell him that I was going to be a good boy and try to do better reporting in the future. And then he gave me the interview with their executive, and then I haven't heard from them again since. I think they hate me, but that's okay. So now the interesting thing, this has nothing to do with net metering. This is a cool kind of new thing that's happening, a new front in the solar wars, you might say. So this is kind of like if you can't beat them, join them kind of thing. So now Arizona Public Service actually wants to own their own rooftop solar system. So they got approved by the state to spend about $30 million on a pilot project for rooftop solar. So the deal is that they basically are going to come to your house. They're going to solicit people in their service area to come. They'll install solar on your house for free, and you can, and then you reap the benefits in the form of a lower bill. which allows them, there are some good things about this. I mean, it allows Arizona Public Service to target houses that are going to produce solar when the utility really needs it. So remember I said there's a disconnect between when people use power and when solar panels are the most productive. And if you're a solar company, you're going to put panels on the part of a person's roof where they're going to get the most solar, because that's how net metering works. You get paid for net metering on a per kilowatt hour basis, so you want to get the most solar power that you can. But that might not always serve the purposes of the grid if the time when they need the most power is not in the middle of the day, but in the late afternoon. So Arizona Public Service is going to target west-facing roofs rather than south-facing roofs that get less solar overall but produce it more in the afternoon. Right? That's kind of complicated and boring. And they also get to target low-income houses that may not be eligible for solar leases or other things. But at the same time, as one analyst for Bloomberg New Energy Finance put it to me, this is really just all about control and trying to maintain their monopoly. And the concerns are that they're going to be able to leverage their much larger capital base and kind of market control to undercut third-party solar companies. And also getting back to this rate-basing thing, which is where they build infrastructure and then charge their customers in the form of higher rates for it. They're going to do that with these solar panels also. I mean, the guy told me that. He was very straight up about it. So, you know, if APS is building solar on everyone's roofs, I mean, that's going to raise people's utility bills the same as it would if they were building a new power plant or something. Maybe not as much, but it's the same concept. So this is a way for them to not only control the market, but to be able to pass the costs back onto their customers. And other utilities, I've heard some scuttlebutt that maybe other utilities around the country are also starting to take this kind of thing more seriously and look at this. I think maybe there's an example in New Hampshire and one with the San Diego utility maybe, but I don't know. So I think this is an emerging thing. Not everywhere is like that though. This is my last case study in New York. This is on the kind of opposite side of the spectrum. So New York actually has, and Kevin can tell you all the details about this if you're interested, they have this really great, the Public Service Commission working with the governor has come up with this really cool, they're basically reforming their whole energy system in the state. They're calling it REV, which stands for something, what is it?
Reforming the energy vision.
Reforming the energy vision, yeah. So this includes a whole bunch of changes, but one of the recent ones that I wrote about is that they're actually, now in New York, utility companies are now banned from owning rooftop solar. That was the decision that just came out recently, a couple months ago. Except in some rare cases, again, low-income housing being an important one because utility companies are much better positioned to put solar panels on the roof of like NYCHA housing in Brooklyn than Con Ed would be. I mean, Con Ed is more equipped to do that than a solar company would be. But New York is going to keep utilities out of the market in most other cases, which they think is going to it's going to open up more market competition for between third-party solar companies, hopefully lower the cost for everyone, hopefully get more solar, and they're basically redirecting the utilities and incentivizing them in other ways. So giving them benefits for their performance, giving them incentives for being energy efficient. One example being that there's a Con Ed wanted to build, Con Ed, by the way, just to close the circle, Con Ed being the modern day, I mean, that Pearl Street station that I showed you, that's Con Ed. I mean, that was the beginning of Con Ed, they're still around. Con Ed wanted to build this, they thought that they wanted to build this power substation in Brooklyn. They were good because they needed to put more power out there for some projects, low-income housing projects. And working with the state through the new incentives under REV, they decided that actually what would be way better is rather than building this substation, they were just going to do a bunch of energy efficiency upgrades in these low-income housing projects and just make them use a lot less power. So they didn't need to build a new station out there. And that's worked out great. And they decided, they scrapped the plan. They're going to save millions of dollars by not building the substation. And I think now they're at the stage of, I don't know if they've actually really started constructing any of these energy efficiency upgrades yet, because this is all just happening now. So, but that's coming down the line. And somebody that I talked to in New York said, this is as exciting as the Public Service Commission gets. So I hope that you are all riveted by that. I know my readers are. I mean, you can see the challenges of trying to report on this stuff. Okay, and so that's that for my case studies, and I would just say that there's a lot more where that came from. I mean, that's just stuff that I've done recently. This map is put together by the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, which is a group out of Minneapolis that tracks challenges to distributed generation. And these red states, anywhere there's a red state, there's some kind of state-level challenge either to net metering or to some other kind of distributed generation, pro-solar or pro-distributed generation policy. So, I mean, I focused a lot on Arizona. I don't know why. Arizona is really egregious in this, and also I'm from Arizona originally, so maybe that has something to do with it. But anyway, Arizona is just one example, and this is happening all over the country. And there was this headline that I put up here: solar rooftop energy harms minorities, claims news outlet tied to utility industry. That's a story in The Intercept just last week. So this is still happening, and there's varying degrees of shady tactics that are being employed. So that's that for solar, and you can kind of see that there's a lot more where this came from, and there's more to do on this subject. And I just wanted to throw into the mix here the other thing that's coming up. So while this is all kind of percolating at the state level, don't forget that there's also a higher level to this at the kind of federal level with the Clean Power Plan, which you're probably all familiar with, but is Obama's kind of flagship climate policy to reduce nationwide carbon emissions 30% by 2030 over 25 levels. And this is in the courts, well, it was in the courts just recently. And there's a lot of, there's a lot of other kind of controversy happening with this now. So there's ALEC has backed several state bills to give state legislators power to veto plans that governors' departments of environmental planning come up with. Those already passed in Pennsylvania and Arizona. You have Mitch McConnell telling state, he wrote this amazing, which you should read, it's amazing op-ed for this newspaper in Kentucky recently where he just says, just don't do it. Just forget it. Don't comply with the Clean Power Plan. We're going to win in court, and just break the law. It's no big deal. And then, of course, you're all probably familiar with this recent case where Murray Energy, a coal company, and several Republican-led states that are either major producers of or consumers of coal, about a dozen of them, had come together in federal court in DC to try to stop the EPA from implementing this plan, which got thrown out because the final rule hasn't even been announced yet, and we all knew that was going to happen. But it was also this interesting thing with Lawrence Tribe. You guys probably know this story. I mean, Lawrence Tribe being Obama's constitutional law professor at Harvard who was representing Murray Energy in this. And if you haven't read, there's a really great profile of Lawrence Tribe in the context of the Clean Power Plan in the New Yorker recently, kind of explaining, did he sell out? How does this fit into his former rulings on other things? So if you haven't read that, it's really great. Check it out. Even this week, even right now, as we speak, there are a slew of bills in the House and other hearings in the Senate that are trying to undermine either the EPA generally or this proposed regulation specifically. And many of which are being led by the scary white men with glasses that I put up here. James Inhofe, the climate denier in chief, senator, Republican senator from Oklahoma, Ed Whitfield, Republican congressman of Kentucky, Mitch McConnell, Republican senator from Kentucky, and then that's Lawrence Tribe at the end. So this is another thing. This is another moving target that I'm keeping an eye on. Okay, and then last thing, how do we cover this? Because for me as a journalist, lurking in the background of all of these things is just the kind of broader issue of climate communication. How do we tell stories about this? How do you get people interested in this subject? And that's a whole other presentation, but I thought I would just very briefly touch on a few quick things. So the first one being that we collaborate. That's what Climate Desk is all about. Remember those partner publications that I had at the beginning? We have found that collaborating on this stuff, working across publications, sharing resources is a vital tool to covering issues that have pressing public interest, but that don't really sell ad space. And Mother Jones is a nonprofit. We get most of our money from donors. I mean, from the benefit of our dedicated readers, and you should all. I encourage you all to join that club. But basically, collaborating between publications is a great way to get more eyeballs on this subject than you would be able to with the resources of any one publication. The other thing we do is we make it personal. this is kind of true for all news, but you have to make this stuff immediately obvious in the first line of the piece. Why does anyone care about this? Because the default assumption, not only for climate change, I mean, especially for like energy policy, no one cares, okay? No readers care about this, and you can't make them care. You can't force a story down anyone's throat, and it's boring and no one cares, and so you have to make it very clear to people, every story right away at the very beginning, why this matters to them. Which is another reason why rooftop solar is a great story for us, because it's easy for people to wrap their minds around. When people care about like having solar panels, they might want to have solar panels on their own roof. Or it's at least something that's, it's easy to kind of conceptualize. It's easy to grasp. It's easy to make personal. So that's another reason why this story has gained a lot of traction for me and my publication. And then the other thing, last thing, viral packaging. So that's a little bit of media jargon for you there, meaning that at all stages of the production process, from the time that we come up with a story to the time when we hit publish and then promote it on social media, we're always thinking about ways to make this get more traction on the internet. How can we write a better headline? What kind of images can we use? Can we make charts? All those charts that I showed you at the beginning are ones that I made for stories that do super well when you attach one of those little solar facts to a tweet. I mean, it goes crazy. People love that stuff. And so if you have these kind of bite-sized pieces, it makes it a lot more digestible for people. So we're always in the business of figuring out how to make that happen. And one recent piece that I think we did that I think ticks all three of these boxes, and which I promised to you at the beginning, is we covered the Heartland Institute's recent conference in Washington, D.C., and asked people what they thought about the Pope. And here's what they said.
Everyone that lives out in the field with the courage to stand up for what we all believe is right.
Blow it. How do I get it to go back?
Yes, we did. Did we go? I don't think we went. But I gave that.
Where's the little thing? Oh.
Did he go?
Okay, bear with me. Here we go. Can people hear that okay?
Every year I have to turn away dozens upon dozens of highly qualified experts who would like to speak here. So if you are here, you made the cut.
Everyone that lives out in the field with the courage to stand up for what we all believe is right. Polar bears. There is a problem with polar bears right now. It's overpopulation.
I'm Suzanne Goldenberg from The Guardian, and I'm here at the Heartland Institute's annual climate conference. This is the hub for those who reject the science of climate change. So we went out to ask them what they thought about the Pope and this very big year for climate.
It's Pope. Everyone's going to ride the Pope now. Stay with it.
I think he's very ill-informed and he's ill-judged in doing this.
I don't believe that this is a moral issue. Unfortunately, the Pope has been inundated with green advisors.
Well, actually, I think the Pope's irrelevant on this issue. My feeling is the Catholic Church has been losing its support, losing its congregation, and he's just one more opinion.
I think the Pope is seriously, terribly misinformed. He's doing a terrible disservice to the entire Catholic theology. He is way, way out of line.
Well, I think it's going to be a big mistake for him. I think that he's going to come up with a document that is going to be ripped to shreds. And I think it's going to confuse Catholics ultimately. The Pope is basically being horribly ill-served.
Considering the popes in the past have put people to death on by incinerating them, what the Pope did to Galileo, I don't subscribe to anything he says at this point.
I think if you would see the science as it is,
then you would understand that it's more important to raise people out of poverty and give them that opportunity rather than fighting a mythical global warming crisis.
The distance between church and state is rapidly vanishing when it comes to climate. It's okay to co-opt religion to advance the climate agenda, and I think that's just going to backfire on him.
And skeptics have their work cut out for them to try to overpower the Pope's influence. Yeah.
But I believe the truth will win out. I believe that the truth is on our side.
You remember that, you guys? This is kind of neat. You know, it's the first time in the history of the United States Senate that a senator has thrown a snowball at the resigning officer.
Anyway, can't make this stuff up.
Where's that?
All right, thank you. I think we have a couple minutes to take some questions.
Real quick, how is that available to the rest of us?
This video?
Yeah.
Oh, I think, you can just Google it. I forget what the name of the story was. I think on the headline we gave it on Mother Jones was like, we asked a bunch of climate change deniers about the Pope, here's what they say, or something like that.
Any comment on the potential conflicts between solar developers and the communities in which they want to locate facilities? On the front page of our local newspaper, Valley News today, there's a story about Green Mountain Power proposing to construct, I think it's the largest solar array in Vermont, in Windsor, and various tax benefits, local concerns. There's another big project proposed up in Stratford nearby, and that's generating a lot of conversation. There seem to be sort of three concerns that pop up. One is local environmental impact. There's a concern that the project in Windsor will take one of the last open meadows we've got in this part of the state, predator for birds, no bad idea. The other thing is neighbors get up and say, if you've got this great big set of array, it's going to reduce my property values. And I'm all for solar, but who's going to take care of me? And the other thing is that once these projects land and you begin to look into them, you discover that the solar lobbyists have been pretty busy working on state tax law and exempting landowners who would site facilities and solar developers from taxes that would ordinarily apply to commercial enterprises. So there's sort of a local tax shift at work. I begin to sound like somebody I'm not, but there is at least the appearance of a local tax shift.
Yeah.
Taxes are being shifted to everybody else in order to support solar. Have you looked into that array of issues?
Yeah, and another thing that you didn't mention, which Kevin and I were talking about the other day, is that there's a question about whether if you build a big solar array in Vermont, are Vermonters actually going to, is that what you say, Vermonters? Is that the appropriate term? Are they actually going to get the solar power from that or not? I mean, because there's always the possibility that the company doing it might build the panels, but then sell the kind of green benefits elsewhere. And I think in the biggest possible picture, you have to be careful with people who are making those arguments. Have to be careful not to go too far down the NIMBY road, because you have to remember that all energy production has an environmental benefit. There's no zero impact way to do it that we've figured out yet that I'm aware of. So you have to put this stuff somewhere. I would much rather have a solar panel in the field next to my house than a nuclear power plant or a coal-fired power plant. So I think or even a wind farm, to be honest. I mean, solar panels just sit there. They don't even make noise or anything. So I think in the array of options, I would say solar isn't that bad. But I think it's also, I think in the same way that one thing you've seen with the fracking boom that I think is not often talked about is that, to me, one of the most important issues that doesn't get talked about is local control, is zoning, people being empowered to make their own decisions. I mean, some of the most egregious stuff with fracking that I've seen is not cases necessarily where there's a particular pollution impact, but where states strip local communities of their power to make their own decisions about what goes where. And so I think that people need to decide what their priorities are and be empowered to make those decisions locally. And certainly there's a lot more reporting, I'm sure, to do about what's really happening with these tax deals. Definitely. I think maybe, ma'am,
you mentioned Elon Musk and the power wall for the battery storage for rooftop, but much more importantly, he's come out with grid-level utility scale batteries, which is absolutely transformational for what's happening in energy.
Yeah, totally.
And of course, there will be issues of, where you're going to site them. I'm a legislator in New Hampshire, and we passed a bill yesterday where there's going to be an application fee for electric generation facilities, any generator, $50,000. If it's natural gas, $100 additional. If it's coal or oil, $150 additional. If it's wind, $1,000 per megawatt for the first 40 megawatts and $1,500 for every megawatt over 40. And if it's solar, which is cleverly disguised as other, it's a double fee. So the $50,000 base and the $50,000 additional. That was passed yesterday.
Wow.
What were your opposition?
That's a moving target.
I voted against it. Yeah.
Yeah,
A lot of good it did.
As you were talking about the death spiral and cost shifting, it struck me that the fundamental problem here is that the corporate institutional structure is inappropriate for the solar technologies that we've got. And my initial reaction was that at least some of those issues one might be able to ameliorate by breaking apart the grid from the coal-fired power plants and have the grid operated basically as some sort of common carrier. But then as I pondered it, I realized that could create some problems, because here it's not like a common carrier railroad, but the reliability issues would argue in favor of some real strong contracts between the people generating the power and the grid. So I guess the general question is, what's going on in the way of structural reform of these institutions, which just seem to be ill-suited to the energy technologies that we're seeing?
Totally, yeah. So this kind of gets back to what I was talking about in New York with the REV. Basically, we have to come up with a way to, the way that utilities have always worked is under a certain regime of incentives that incentivize having lots of power, having reliable power, having affordable power. Basically a set of goals that in the modern context are not the same goals that we actually want utilities to do now. We need to come up with a way to incentivize utilities and pay them to do the things that we actually want them to do, which in the context of solar means managing the flow of energy from a wide variety of disparate resources rather than just simply sending electrons in one direction. And this is what New York is starting to try to do, is to create different types of incentives that reward things like energy efficiency, that reward things like performance standards, and so that you're getting utilities, you're paying utilities to perform a service that is valuable and that you want them to do, but that's not based on the same priorities that it always has been. And I think that's how to do that exactly. That's what utilities around the country and public regulators are trying to figure out right now. It's not an easy question, for sure. Yeah. Oh, actually, I'm sorry. I think you were first.
In that same vein, my question was on the term energy democracy and the growth of that both internationally and in the U.S. Featuring, I know cooperatives are playing a big role, as well as public utilities. Mm-hmm. So I was curious, are you and Mother Jones and the Climate Desk, have y'all reported much on that movement? And if not, why? And I would encourage you to do so.
Yeah.
Because it is addressing very much the structural reform about how we should take ownership of our energy, and particularly very concerned about future ecological collapse to where we would need to rely on more of a localized form of production.
Yeah.
And not only production, but also ownership.
Yeah, totally. Well, I haven't written about that a lot yet, but I'd love to get more into it and talk afterwards if there's a specific story that you think would be worthy of covering, for sure. Super interesting.
Others at the Climate Desk, you haven't read too much about it?
No, no. But we'd love to. We're it's all we have an unending appetite, as long as it's interesting for our readers and stuff. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Becca, and I'm from Hartford, Vermont. And Joel and I both work for Sun Common, which is a solar power company out of Waterbury, and we function only in Vermont. And I just had a question. One thing that we talk a lot about in the office is that eventually the federal credit, which currently pays for 30% of a solar system, is going away in the next year. So currently you can get, the federal government will pay for 30% of your residential solar. I guess my question is, how much research have you done, or how much have you looked at why the federal credit for solar is going away versus like government credits and tax breaks for other forms of energy are staying strong and in fact increasing.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you have any context for that. I don't know that.
I don't know the details of the FTC. I mean, I know that with the same thing always is, this is always controversial with the PTC for wind also, and I think it just makes a difference. It depends on who you have representing you in Congress and which industry is more important in your state. I mean, in Iowa, for example, which has a huge wind industry, you had, he's gone now, or Grassley was always a big fan of wind, and so I think it kind of just depends on who your advocates are. I don't know. I wish I knew more about that. I should look into the details of that FTC. If you're comparing the FTC to the PTC for wind, there's probably an interesting story there. If you count subsidies for fossil generation, then obviously that's a whole other can of worms. Those are 100-year-old subsidies that date back to the time when oil was first tapped in Texas. There will be blood style subsidies. So those, and that's a much bigger problem. Why do we still have those? Why are they so much? Fossil fuel executives of fossil fuel companies don't even want these things in a lot of cases. So that's an even bigger problem, I think, as well. So there's a lot to look at.
They're pushing that money right back.
Courtney, do we have time for more?
Well, why don't we wrap up now, and then if you have time to
Yeah.
stick around for some questions one-on-one, we can do that.
Great. Okay, well, thanks everyone. Appreciate it.
Thank you.